The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traoré made his way to the military headquarters. The air was thick with the familiar scent of burning charcoal and the distant sound of motorcycles weaving through traffic. This was his country, Burkina Faso, and every day he witnessed both its beauty and its struggles. Traoré had always been different from other military officers. While many focused solely on protocol and hierarchy, he possessed an unusual gift for reading people. His colleagues often joked that he could spot a liar from across a crowded room, but Traoré knew it was more than intuition. Years of watching his people suffer under corruption had sharpened his instincts like a blade. As he entered his office that Tuesday morning, his aide handed him a stack of intelligence reports. Most were routine security briefings, but one particular document caught his attention. It detailed unusual activity around the French diplomatic compound, specifically mentioning late-night meetings and suspicious financial transactions. The relationship between Burkina Faso and France had always been complicated. Despite gaining independence decades ago, French influence remained strong through various agreements and diplomatic channels. Traoré understood politics, but he also understood justice. When foreign powers exploited his people, it didn't matter what flag they flew or what language they spoke. His phone buzzed with a message from Lieutenant Sankara, one of his most trusted officers. The text was brief but alarming. "Sir, you need to see the new intelligence on the embassy. Something big is happening." Traoré immediately called Sankara to his office. When Sankara arrived, his usually calm demeanor showed signs of stress. He placed a folder on Traoré's desk and began explaining what his surveillance team had discovered. Over the past 3 weeks, they had noticed unusual patterns in the movements of French diplomatic staff, particularly involving one senior diplomat named Philippe Dubois. Dubois had been in Burkina Faso for 2 years, officially serving as an economic attaché. However, Sankara's team had observed him meeting regularly with local businessmen known for their questionable dealings. These weren't official diplomatic meetings held at the embassy or government buildings. Instead, they took place in expensive restaurants, private homes, and sometimes even in remote locations outside the city. What made these meetings more suspicious was the timing. They always occurred when Dubois claimed to be conducting routine economic surveys for French development aid programs. The irony wasn't lost on Traoré that while ordinary citizens struggled to access basic healthcare and education, this diplomat was living lavishly while supposedly helping their economy grow. Sankara spread several photographs across the desk. The images showed Dubois exchanging briefcases with various individuals, including some faces that Traoré recognized as local mining executives. Burkina Faso's gold mines had always attracted foreign interest, and recently there had been concerning reports about illegal extraction operations that seemed to operate without proper government oversight. One photograph particularly caught Traoré's attention. It showed Dubois meeting with Amadou Keita, a businessman who had been under investigation for gold smuggling, but had somehow avoided prosecution. Keita's operations had been linked to environmental damage and worker exploitation. Yet he continued to expand his business empire with apparent immunity from legal consequences. Traoré studied the images carefully, his mind connecting dots that painted an increasingly troubling picture. If a French diplomat was involved in facilitating illegal mining operations, it would explain how certain companies managed to avoid regulatory scrutiny. It would also explain why communities near mining sites had reported increasing problems with local officials ignoring their complaints about environmental damage and unfair labor practices. The captain leaned back in his chair, considering the implications of what he was seeing. This wasn't just about one corrupt diplomat or even one illegal mining operation. This appeared to be a systematic effort to exploit Burkina Faso's natural resources while bypassing the legal frameworks designed to protect both the environment and the people. His thoughts turned to the families in rural communities who had approached him personally, begging for help because their traditional lands were being destroyed by mining operations they couldn't stop through official channels. Children in these areas had developed respiratory problems from dust and chemical pollution, while adults found their farming and grazing lands rendered useless. Traoré had always believed that true leadership meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The evidence before him suggested that a foreign diplomat was actively undermining that protection for personal gain. This wasn't just a legal matter. It was a moral imperative. He instructed Sankara to expand the surveillance operation immediately. They would need more detailed evidence before taking any action, but Traoré was determined to uncover the full extent of this operation. He also ordered background checks on all French diplomatic staff and a review of any recent changes to mining regulations or enforcement policies. As Sankara prepared to leave, Traoré made one final request that would prove crucial to everything that followed. He wanted a complete analysis of financial flows between French companies, local businesses, and government accounts over the past year. If money was being moved illegally, there would be traces, and those traces would lead them to the truth. That evening, as Traoré drove home through the bustling streets of Ouagadougou, he reflected on the responsibility weighing on his shoulders. The people of Burkina Faso had endured decades of exploitation by various foreign interests, often with the complicity of their own leaders. This time, however, things would be different. The streetlights flickered to life as darkness settled over the city. Somewhere in that maze of lights lived millions of people who deserved better than to have their resources stolen by corrupt networks operating under diplomatic immunity. They deserved leaders who would stand up for justice regardless of the political consequences. Traoré knew that confronting a French diplomat would create significant diplomatic tensions. France maintained substantial influence in West Africa, and any action against their representatives could have far-reaching consequences for Burkina Faso's international relationships. However, he also knew that allowing corruption to continue would have far worse consequences for his people. As he pulled into his driveway, Traoré made a silent promise to himself and to his country. Whatever evidence his team uncovered, whatever risks they had to take, justice would be served. The days of foreign exploitation hidden behind diplomatic courtesy were numbered, and he would personally ensure that those responsible would face the consequences of their actions. The investigation that would shake the foundations of French-Burkinabe relations had officially begun, though at this point, none of the participants knew just how dramatically their lives were about to change. 3 weeks had passed since Traoré first saw the photographs of Philippe Dubois. During this time, his surveillance team had worked around the clock, gathering evidence that painted an increasingly damaging picture of diplomatic corruption. What started as suspicious meetings had evolved into a complex web of illegal activities that reached deep into both French and Burkinabe institutions. Lieutenant Sankara knocked on Traoré's office door early that Thursday morning, carrying a thick file that would change everything. His face showed the exhaustion of someone who had spent countless hours piecing together a puzzle that no one wanted solved. As he entered the office, Sankara immediately began spreading documents across Traoré's desk with the precision of someone presenting a legal case. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed regular transfers of significant amounts of money between French companies and local accounts controlled by Amadou Keita and his associates. These transfers always occurred within days of Dubois' meetings with local businessmen, suggesting a direct connection between the diplomat's activities and the money movements. More disturbing were the mining permits and environmental clearances that had been approved, despite clear violations of Burkina Faso's environmental protection laws. Several mining operations had expanded their activities into protected areas, destroying wildlife habitats and contaminating water sources used by local communities. Yet these operations continued to receive official approvals, often signed by officials who had been present at Dubois' private meetings. Traoré studied a particularly damaging document, a letter bearing the official seal of the French embassy, written by Dubois himself. In this letter, addressed to a local mining consortium, the diplomat promised to ensure regulatory flexibility in exchange for what he called partnership opportunities. The language was carefully coded, but the meaning was clear. Dubois was offering to help companies avoid environmental and safety regulations in exchange for financial compensation. The captain's anger grew as he reviewed reports from communities affected by these illegal mining operations. Children as young as 8 years old were working in dangerous conditions, extracting gold from makeshift mines that lacked basic safety equipment. Adults suffered from respiratory diseases caused by exposure to mercury and other toxic chemicals used in the extraction process. Meanwhile, the profits from their suffering were being shared between foreign companies and corrupt officials. One report particularly caught Traoré's attention. It described a village called Tang Hin, where a mining operation had contaminated the primary water source used by over 500 families. Despite repeated complaints to local authorities, nothing had been done to address the contamination. The mining company responsible for the environmental damage was one of the firms that appeared regularly in Dubois' meeting schedule. Sankara presented additional evidence showing how the corruption network operated. Dubois would meet with French business representatives to identify profitable mining opportunities. He would then approach local officials and businessmen like Keita to arrange for the necessary permits and regulatory approvals. In exchange, the French companies would pay substantial fees that were shared between Dubois, local officials, and their Burkinabe partners. The system was sophisticated and well organized. Dubois used his diplomatic status to avoid scrutiny while facilitating deals that violated both countries' laws. The money was laundered through a series of accounts and shell companies, making it difficult to trace the exact amounts involved. However, preliminary estimates suggested that millions of dollars had been stolen from Burkina Faso's economy through these illegal arrangements. Traoré realized that this wasn't just about one corrupt diplomat or even one illegal mining scheme. This was evidence of systematic exploitation that had been operating for years under the protection of diplomatic immunity. The French government might not have been directly involved, but their diplomat was using his official position to facilitate crimes against the Burkinabe people. As he continued reviewing the evidence, Traoré discovered that Dubois had also been manipulating agricultural export contracts. Several French companies had secured exclusive deals to purchase agricultural products from Burkina Faso at prices significantly below market value. These contracts had been negotiated through the same network of corrupt officials who facilitated the mining operations. Local farmers were being paid poverty wages for their crops, while French companies resold the same products in European markets at enormous profits. The price manipulation was so severe that some farmers could barely afford to feed their own families despite working from dawn to dusk producing crops for export. The evidence also revealed that Dubois had been providing French companies with confidential information about Burkina Faso's economic policies and government plans. This insider information allowed these companies to position themselves advantageously for government contracts and investment opportunities, giving them unfair advantages over competitors who didn't have access to diplomatic intelligence. Traoré stood up from his desk and walked to his office window, looking out at the busy street below. Ordinary people were going about their daily lives, unaware that a foreign diplomat was systematically stealing from their country's economy. Street vendors sold goods for small profits, while major mining companies extracted millions of dollars worth of gold with minimal compensation to the communities affected by their operations. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Traoré's shoulders. He knew that confronting Dubois would create a diplomatic crisis that could affect Burkina Faso's relationships with France and other international partners. However, he also knew that allowing this corruption to continue would cause far greater damage to his people's future. He turned back to Sankara and gave clear instructions for the next phase of their investigation. They needed irrefutable evidence that could withstand international scrutiny. This meant obtaining recordings of Dubois' conversations, documented proof of money transfers, and testimony from witnesses who could verify the illegal activities. Sankara nodded grimly, understanding the magnitude of what they were attempting. Investigating a foreign diplomat was dangerous work that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. However, both men had dedicated their lives to serving their country, and they weren't going to let diplomatic protocol protect criminals who were exploiting their people. Over the following days, Traoré's team worked with unprecedented determination. They used sophisticated surveillance equipment to monitor Dubois' communications and movements. They interviewed affected community members, documenting the environmental and social damage caused by illegal mining operations. They traced financial transactions through multiple banks and countries, following the money trail that would ultimately expose the full extent of the corruption network. The evidence continued to accumulate, painting a picture of systematic exploitation that went far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. Dubois wasn't just a corrupt individual taking bribes. He was the centerpiece of an organized criminal enterprise that was stealing millions of dollars from one of the world's poorest countries. As Traoré reviewed the latest batch of evidence, he realized they were approaching a critical decision point. Soon they would have enough proof to take action against Dubois and his network. The question was no longer whether they could prove the diplomat's guilt, but rather how to proceed with justice while minimizing the potential diplomatic fallout that could harm Burkina Faso's international relationships. The breakthrough came on a humid Tuesday evening when Lieutenant Sankara's surveillance team intercepted a phone call that would provide the final piece of evidence needed to expose Philippe Dubois. The French diplomat had become careless, perhaps overconfident in his diplomatic immunity, and this mistake would prove to be his downfall. Traoré was working late in his office when Sankara burst through the door without knocking, something he had never done before. His face showed a mixture of excitement and disbelief as he carried a recording device and a transcript of the conversation they had just captured. The audio quality was crystal clear, and every word would serve as undeniable proof of the diplomat's criminal activities. In the recorded conversation, Dubois was speaking with Amadou Keita about a new mining operation in the eastern region of Burkina Faso. The area was known for its rich gold deposits, but it was also home to several endangered species and served as a water source for dozens of rural communities. According to environmental regulations, mining in this region was strictly prohibited without extensive environmental impact studies and community consent. However, Dubois had assured Keita that these regulations could be bypassed for the right price. In his own words captured clearly on the recording, the diplomat promised to arrange for the necessary officials to look the other way in exchange for a payment of $2 million. Half of this money would go directly to Dubois himself, while the remainder would be distributed among local officials who could influence the permit approval process. What made this conversation even more damaging was Dubois' casual attitude toward the environmental and human consequences of the proposed mining operation. When Keita mentioned concerns about potential water contamination, the diplomat laughed and said that these people have survived worse problems before. His dismissive tone revealed a complete lack of regard for the communities that would be affected by their illegal activities. The recording also captured Dubois providing specific instructions on how to structure the payments. To avoid detection by banking authorities, he recommended using a series of shell companies registered in different countries, with money transfers disguised as payments for consulting services and equipment purchases. This level of detail demonstrated that the diplomat had extensive experience in money laundering and financial crimes. Traoré listened to the entire recording twice, his anger growing with each replay. This wasn't just corruption, it was a complete betrayal of the trust that should exist between diplomatic representatives and host countries. Dubois was supposed to be promoting cooperation and mutual benefit between France and Burkina Faso. Instead, he was actively working to exploit and harm the Burkinabe people. Sankara provided additional context that made the situation even more outrageous. The proposed mining area included a sacred site that held deep cultural and spiritual significance for local communities. For generations, this location had been used for traditional ceremonies and was considered the resting place of ancestral spirits. The destruction of this site would cause irreparable cultural damage that went far beyond the environmental and economic harm. The lieutenant also presented evidence showing that Dubois had been lying to his own government about his activities in Burkina Faso. Official reports sent to Paris described successful development projects and positive diplomatic relations. Meanwhile, the diplomat was actively undermining both countries' interests by facilitating illegal activities that damaged Burkina Faso's environment and economy while tarnishing France's international reputation. Traoré realized that they now had everything needed to expose Dubois and his entire corruption network. The recording provided direct evidence of criminal conspiracy, while the supporting documentation showed the systematic nature of the illegal activities. However, he also understood that their next actions would determine whether justice would be served or whether diplomatic pressure would allow the criminals to escape. Punishment. The captain spent the rest of that evening developing a comprehensive plan for confronting Dubois while protecting his investigation team from potential retaliation. He knew that diplomatic immunity would complicate any legal proceedings, but he was determined to ensure that the evidence reached the appropriate authorities in both countries. His strategy involved multiple simultaneous actions designed to prevent Dubois from destroying evidence or fleeing the country before justice could be served. First, he would coordinate with international law enforcement agencies to freeze the bank accounts associated with the corruption network. Second, he would arrange for the immediate arrest of Amadou Keita and other local conspirators who didn't enjoy diplomatic protection. Most importantly, Traoré planned to personally confront Dubois with the evidence of his crimes. This confrontation would be recorded and witnessed by multiple officials, ensuring that the diplomat couldn't later deny his involvement or claim that the evidence had been fabricated. The recording would also capture Dubois' reaction to being exposed, which could provide additional insights into the full scope of his criminal activities. Sankara raised concerns about the potential diplomatic consequences of such a direct confrontation. France maintained significant influence in West Africa, and accusing their diplomat of serious crimes could result in economic sanctions or other forms of retaliation against Burkina Faso. However, Traoré argued that allowing the corruption to continue would cause far greater long-term damage to their country's sovereignty and development. The captain also recognized that this case could set an important precedent for how African nations dealt with foreign exploitation. For too long, diplomatic immunity had been used as a shield to protect criminals who abused their positions to harm vulnerable populations. By taking a strong stand against Dubois, Burkina Faso could send a message that such behavior would no longer be tolerated. That night, Traoré barely slept as he reviewed every detail of their evidence and planned the confrontation that would take place the following day. He thought about the families in Tung Hin, who were still drinking contaminated water because of illegal mining operations. He remembered the children working in dangerous conditions while foreign companies and corrupt officials profited from their suffering. The evidence against Dubois was overwhelming and undeniable. The recorded conversation alone would be enough to destroy the diplomat's career and potentially result in criminal charges in both countries. However, Traoré knew that gathering evidence was only the first step. The real challenge would be ensuring that justice was actually served, despite the political pressures and diplomatic complications that would inevitably arise. As dawn broke over Ouagadougou, Traoré prepared for what would be one of the most important days of his career. The confrontation with Dubois would determine whether corruption and exploitation could be challenged successfully, or whether diplomatic protocol would continue to protect those who abused their positions to harm innocent people. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation that would test the limits of diplomatic immunity and challenge the traditional power dynamics between African nations and their former colonial powers. Traoré was ready to face whatever consequences might arise from his pursuit of justice. The morning air was thick with tension as Captain Traoré prepared for the confrontation that would change everything. He had spent the night finalizing every detail of his plan, ensuring that when he faced Philippe Dubois, the French diplomat would have no escape from the mountain of evidence that had been carefully assembled over weeks of investigation. At exactly 9 o'clock, Traoré arrived at the French embassy compound with a small team of his most trusted officers. The building stood like a fortress in the heart of Ouagadougou, its white walls and French flags serving as symbols of the colonial relationship that many believed had never truly ended. Today, however, those symbols would be confronted with the reality of justice and accountability. The embassy security guards were clearly surprised by the unexpected visit from military officials. Traoré presented his credentials and formally requested an immediate meeting with Philippe Dubois. His tone was professional but firm, making it clear that this was not a social call or routine diplomatic courtesy. The gravity of the situation was evident in his demeanor, and the embassy staff quickly recognized that something serious was happening. After a brief consultation with embassy officials, Traoré and his team were escorted to a conference room where they would wait for Dubois. The room was elegantly furnished with expensive furniture and artwork that showcased French culture and history. The irony was not lost on Traoré that he was sitting in luxury paid for by French taxpayers while preparing to expose a diplomat who had been stealing from one of the world's poorest countries. When Dubois finally entered the room, his confident smile and casual demeanor revealed that he had no idea what was about to happen. The diplomat was well-dressed and carried himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to operating above the law. He greeted Traoré with false warmth, probably expecting a routine discussion about some minor administrative matter. Traoré began the confrontation by placing a large folder on the conference table. The folder contained copies of all the evidence his team had gathered: photographs, bank records, official documents, and transcripts of recorded conversations. As he opened the folder, Dubois' expression began to change from confidence to curiosity, and then to growing concern as he realized the scope of what was being presented. The captain started with the photographs, showing Dubois meeting with Amadou, Keita, and other known criminals involved in illegal mining operations. Each photograph was dated and showed clear evidence of the diplomat's involvement in activities that violated both diplomatic protocols and criminal laws. Dubois initially tried to dismiss these meetings as routine diplomatic contacts, but his explanations became increasingly weak as more evidence was presented. When Traoré produced the bank records showing money transfers between French companies and accounts controlled by Dubois' associates, the diplomat's composure began to crack. The financial evidence was detailed and thorough, showing patterns of payments that coincided exactly with the timing of illegal mining permits and regulatory approvals. There was no innocent explanation for these financial connections. The most devastating moment came when Traoré played the recorded conversation between Dubois and Keita discussing the $2 million payment for bypassing environmental regulations. As the diplomat's own voice filled the room, promising to help destroy protected areas for money, his face went pale and his hands began to shake. The recording was clear and unambiguous, leaving no room for denial or alternative explanations. Dubois' initial response was to claim that the recording was fabricated, but Traoré was prepared for this defense. He presented technical analysis proving the authenticity of the recording, along with corroborating evidence that confirmed every detail mentioned in the conversation. The diplomat's lies crumbled under the weight of overwhelming proof. As the evidence continued to accumulate on the table, Dubois' demeanor shifted from denial to desperate attempts at justification. He claimed that his actions were necessary to promote French business interests and strengthen economic ties between the two countries. This argument only made his situation worse, as it demonstrated that he understood his actions were wrong but had chosen to proceed. Anyway, for personal gain, the confrontation reached its climax when Traoré presented evidence of the environmental and human damage caused by Dubois' illegal activities. Photographs showed contaminated water sources, sick children, and destroyed agricultural land. Medical reports documented respiratory diseases and other health problems directly linked to illegal mining operations that the diplomat had helped facilitate. When faced with images of children suffering from preventable diseases caused by his criminal activities, Dubois finally broke down. The weight of his actions became impossible to ignore when confronted with their human consequences. His carefully constructed facade of diplomatic respectability crumbled, revealing the truth about his character and motivations. Traoré then delivered the final blow by presenting evidence that Dubois had been systematically lying to his own government about his activities in Burkina Faso. Official reports to Paris described successful development programs and positive diplomatic achievements, while the diplomat was actually facilitating crimes that damaged both countries' interests and international reputations. The room fell silent as Dubois realized that his career was over and that he would likely face criminal charges in both France and Burkina Faso. His diplomatic immunity might protect him from immediate arrest, but it couldn't protect him from the political and legal consequences of the evidence that had been gathered against him. Traoré concluded the confrontation by formally demanding that Dubois cease all illegal activities immediately and cooperate fully with ongoing investigations. He also announced that copies of all evidence would be provided to French authorities, Burkinabe prosecutors, and international law enforcement agencies. The diplomat would not be able to escape justice by simply leaving the country or hiding behind diplomatic protocols. As the meeting ended, Dubois sat in stunned silence, apparently unable to comprehend how his carefully hidden criminal empire had been so thoroughly exposed. His arrogance had been replaced by fear and desperation as he faced the reality that his actions would have serious consequences for both his career and his freedom. The other embassy officials who had been present during the confrontation were equally shocked by the revelations. They had worked alongside Dubois for years without realizing the extent of his criminal activities. The evidence presented by Traoré painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond anything they had imagined possible. As Traoré and his team prepared to leave the embassy, they knew that their work was far from over. The confrontation had been successful in exposing Dubois and presenting irrefutable evidence of his crimes. However, the real test would be ensuring that this evidence led to appropriate legal action and meaningful consequences for all those involved in the corruption network. The diplomatic crisis that would inevitably follow this confrontation would test Burkina Faso's resolve in international relationships. However, Traoré was confident that justice would ultimately prevail, regardless of the political challenges that lay ahead. The aftermath of Traoré's confrontation with Philippe Dubois created waves that spread far beyond the walls of the French embassy. Within hours of the meeting, diplomatic phones were ringing across 3 continents as news of the explosive evidence against the French diplomat reached the highest levels of government in both France and Burkina Faso. Captain Traoré returned to his headquarters, knowing that his actions had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The evidence against Dubois was undeniable, but challenging a foreign diplomat would inevitably trigger a diplomatic crisis that could reshape his country's international relationships. However, he remained convinced that the pursuit of justice justified any political complications that might arise. The first sign of the brewing storm came within 2 hours of the embassy confrontation. Traoré received an urgent summons to meet with President Kaboré's chief of staff, along with the foreign minister and several other high-ranking officials. The speed of this response indicated that word of his actions had already reached the highest levels of government, probably through panicked communications from the French embassy. When Traoré arrived at the presidential palace, the atmosphere was tense and charged with uncertainty. The officials gathered in the secure conference room represented the key decision-makers who would determine how Burkina Faso would respond to the diplomatic crisis that was rapidly developing. Their faces showed a mixture of concern, curiosity, and barely contained anxiety about the international implications of the situation. Foreign Minister Ouedraogo was the first to speak, his voice reflecting the diplomatic training that had taught him to remain calm, even in the most challenging circumstances. He asked Traoré to present a complete summary of the evidence against Dubois, emphasizing the need for absolute certainty before proceeding with any actions that could damage relations with France. Traoré methodically presented every piece of evidence his team had gathered, from the initial photographs through the damning recorded conversation that had sealed Dubois' fate. As each document was reviewed and each recording was played, the expressions around the table shifted from skepticism to amazement to growing anger at the scope of the diplomat's criminal activities. The recorded conversation proved to be particularly powerful because it captured Dubois in his own words, describing how he manipulated Burkinabe officials and exploited the country's natural resources for personal gain. The casual arrogance in his voice as he discussed destroying protected environmental areas and contaminating water sources used by rural communities was deeply offensive to the Burkinabe officials. Listening to his words, President Kaboré's chief of staff asked pointed questions about the legal implications of the evidence and the potential consequences of pursuing criminal charges against a diplomat with immunity. Traoré acknowledged that diplomatic immunity would complicate legal proceedings, but he argued that the evidence was so overwhelming that it demanded action, regardless of diplomatic protocols. The discussion became heated when the foreign minister raised concerns about potential French retaliation. Against Burkina Faso, France remained a major economic partner and aid provider, and antagonizing the French government could result in reduced development assistance, trade restrictions, or other forms of economic pressure that would harm ordinary Burkinabe citizens. However, Traoré countered this argument by pointing to the evidence of how much money Dubois had already stolen from the Burkinabe economy through his illegal activities. The diplomat's corruption network had cost the country millions of dollars in lost revenues and had caused immeasurable environmental and social damage. Allowing this exploitation to continue would ultimately cause far more harm than any potential French retaliation. The meeting was interrupted by an urgent phone call from the French ambassador, who was demanding an immediate explanation for what he called outrageous allegations against a member of his diplomatic staff. The ambassador's tone was described as both angry and defensive, suggesting that French officials were already preparing to protect Dubois despite the evidence against him. This call confirmed Traoré's suspicions that diplomatic pressure would be used to shield Dubois from the consequences of his crimes. However, it also strengthened his resolve to ensure that justice would be served regardless of political interference. The recorded conversation alone provided enough evidence to destroy the diplomat's career and potentially result in criminal prosecution. Meanwhile, news of the confrontation had begun to leak to international media outlets. Within 6 hours of the embassy meeting, reporters from major news organizations were calling government offices and requesting statements about the allegations against the French diplomat. The story was particularly explosive because it involved themes of neocolonial exploitation and diplomatic corruption that resonated with audiences across Africa and Europe. Traoré worked through the night preparing additional documentation that would be needed if the case proceeded to formal legal proceedings. His team had identified dozens of specific instances where Dubois had violated both diplomatic protocols and criminal laws. They had also traced the flow of stolen money through multiple international banking systems, creating a paper trail that would be difficult for defense lawyers to challenge. The captain also coordinated with Lieutenant Sankara to ensure the protection of witnesses and evidence. They had received intelligence suggesting that Dubois' associates were already attempting to destroy documents and intimidate people who might testify against the corruption network. Several key witnesses were placed under protective custody to prevent retaliation. By the following morning, the story had exploded across international media platforms. Headlines described diplomatic scandal in West Africa and French diplomat caught in corruption scheme. The detailed evidence that Traoré had gathered provided journalists with compelling material that supported their reporting and made the story impossible for French officials to dismiss as unfounded allegations. The media attention created additional pressure on both governments to respond decisively to the scandal. Public opinion in Burkina Faso strongly supported Traoré's actions, with many citizens expressing pride that their military had finally stood up to foreign exploitation. However, reactions in France were more divided, with some officials defending Dubois while others called for a thorough investigation of his activities. The turning point came when French prosecutors announced that they would conduct their own investigation into the allegations against Dubois. This decision represented a significant victory for Traoré because it meant that French authorities were taking the evidence seriously rather than dismissing it as a diplomatic misunderstanding. The prospect of criminal prosecution in France would make it much more difficult for Dubois to escape justice. However, Traoré also received concerning intelligence about attempts to discredit him and his investigation team. Some French officials were reportedly spreading rumors that the evidence had been fabricated or that the investigation was politically motivated. These attacks on his credibility were expected, but they represented a serious threat to the integrity of the legal proceedings that would follow. As the fifth day after the confrontation drew to a close, Traoré reflected on how dramatically the situation had evolved. What had begun as a routine investigation into suspicious diplomatic activities had become an international scandal that was testing the limits of diplomatic immunity and challenging traditional power. Relationships between African nations and their former colonial masters. The evidence against Dubois was overwhelming and undeniable, but the political battle over how to respond to that evidence was just beginning. Traoré remained committed to ensuring that justice would be served, but he also understood that the most difficult challenges lay ahead, as various political and diplomatic interests attempted to influence the outcome of the case. 6 months after Captain Traoré first confronted Philippe Dubois at the French embassy, justice had finally been served in a manner that exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. The diplomatic scandal that had begun with suspicious photographs and recorded conversations had evolved into one of the most significant corruption cases in modern African history, with consequences that would reshape diplomatic relationships across the continent. The French government's decision to waive Dubois' diplomatic immunity had come after weeks of intense international pressure and mounting evidence that made his guilt undeniable. French President Macron himself had announced that France would not protect diplomats who exploited African nations, marking a significant shift in policy that acknowledged the changing dynamics between France and its former colonies. Dubois now sat in a French prison, having been sentenced to 12 years for corruption, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit environmental crimes. The French courts had been thorough in their prosecution, using every piece of evidence that Traoré's team had provided. The recorded conversation had been particularly devastating during the trial, as it captured the diplomat's callous attitude toward the people he was supposed to serve. The trial had also exposed the full extent of the corruption network that Dubois had created. Amadou Keita received a 15-year sentence in Burkina Faso courts, while several other local officials were imprisoned for their roles in facilitating illegal mining operations. The network had stolen an estimated $23 million from the Burkinabe economy over 3 years, money that was now being recovered and returned to government accounts. More importantly, the environmental damage caused by illegal mining operations was being systematically repaired. International development organizations had provided funding for water treatment systems in affected communities, while reforestation programs were restoring areas that had been destroyed by unauthorized mining activities. The village of Tanghin, which had been particularly affected by water contamination, now had access to clean drinking water for the first time in years. Traoré had been promoted to colonel in recognition of his exceptional service to the nation. However, the promotion meant less to him than the knowledge that his actions had protected vulnerable communities and established important precedents for fighting corruption. He had proven that diplomatic immunity could not protect those who abused their positions to exploit innocent people. The international impact of the case had been profound. Several other African nations had launched their own investigations into suspicious diplomatic activities, using Traoré's methods as a model for their own anti-corruption efforts. The African Union had passed new resolutions strengthening oversight of foreign diplomatic activities, while international law enforcement agencies had enhanced cooperation to combat cross-border corruption. French diplomatic practices across Africa had undergone significant reforms following the scandal. New oversight mechanisms had been established to monitor diplomatic activities, while stricter controls had been placed on financial transactions involving embassy staff. The French Foreign Ministry had also implemented new training programs to ensure that diplomats understood the legal and ethical boundaries of their work. The media attention generated by the case had also led to broader discussions about neo-colonial exploitation in Africa. Academic institutions, policy think tanks, and international organizations had all examined the case as an example of how traditional power relationships between former colonial powers and African nations were being challenged by a new generation of African leaders committed to sovereignty and justice for the communities that had been directly affected by Dubois' crimes. The justice served represented something even more significant than legal punishment. Children in mining areas were now attending school instead of working in dangerous conditions. Families had access to clean water and medical care. Agricultural lands were being restored to productive use. The abstract concept of justice had been transformed into concrete improvements in people's daily lives. Lieutenant Sankara, who had been instrumental in gathering the evidence against Dubois, had also been promoted and was now leading a new anti-corruption unit within the military. This specialized team was responsible for investigating suspicious activities by foreign nationals and ensuring that diplomatic immunity could not be used to shield criminal behavior. Their work had already resulted in several additional investigations and prosecutions. The French embassy in Ouagadougou had undergone significant changes following the scandal. A new ambassador had been appointed with specific instructions to rebuild trust and establish more transparent relationships with Burkinabe institutions. The embassy now published regular reports on its activities and had established community liaison programs to ensure that local concerns were heard and addressed. International mining companies operating in Burkina Faso had also been affected by the increased scrutiny that followed the case. Environmental regulations were now strictly enforced, and companies that violated these rules faced immediate prosecution and substantial financial penalties. The days when foreign companies could operate with impunity through corrupt relationships with local officials were definitively over. Traoré often reflected on how the investigation had evolved, from those first suspicious photographs to this comprehensive transformation of diplomatic and business practices. The success had required not just determination and courage, but also careful planning, international cooperation, and unwavering commitment to justice despite significant political pressures. The case had also demonstrated the importance of protecting and supporting whistleblowers and investigators who challenged powerful interests. Several international organizations had established new programs to provide security and legal support for African officials investigating foreign corruption, using Traoré's experience as a model for best practices. As he looked back on the entire experience, Traoré felt a deep sense of satisfaction that justice had been served not just through punishment of the guilty, but through systemic changes that would protect future generations from similar exploitation. The children of Tangan could now drink clean water, attend school, and look forward to a future free from the environmental damage that had once seemed inevitable. The diplomatic relationship between France and Burkina Faso had actually strengthened following the resolution of the scandal. By holding Dubois accountable and implementing meaningful reforms, France had demonstrated respect for Burkinabe, sovereignty, and commitment to genuine partnership. Rather than exploitative relationships, the legacy of Traoré's investigation extended far beyond the specific case of Philippe Dubois. It had shown that African nations could successfully challenge foreign exploitation, that justice could prevail over diplomatic privilege, and that individual courage and determination could create systemic change that benefited entire communities. Most importantly, the case had sent a clear message to anyone tempted to abuse diplomatic positions or exploit African resources. Corruption would be exposed, criminals would be prosecuted, and justice would ultimately be served, regardless of nationality, diplomatic status, or political connections. The age of impunity was over, and Africa's sovereignty would be defended by leaders like Traoré, who understood that true patriotism meant protecting their people from all forms of exploitation.